A Kansas farmer never expected that a simple walk along his fence line would lead him to a chained wild horse whose scars carried secrets darker than any storm. From the first trembling glance to the night fireworks, tore open old wounds, their lives intertwined with a boy's grief and a vet's warnings. This is not just a story about saving a horse. It's about how a scarred animal saved the people who dared to stand beside him. The late October wind swept across the Kansas plains, bending the brittle stalks of corn that had already been cut down to stubble. The earth smelled faintly of smoke from nearby fields where neighbors had burned the leftovers of the season, a ritual as old as farming itself. Ethan Walker adjusted his worn cap, boots crunching on the dry soil as he followed the fence line at the far edge of his property. At 52, the farmer's back was still straight, though his shoulders carried the weight of years, and his eyes had the haunted distance of someone who had lost more than a harvest. For Ethan, the routine of walking his land was a kind of meditation. Since his wife had passed 3 years earlier, silence had become both his companion and his punishment. He spoke little, ate simply, and worked the land with the stubborn persistence that people in Kansas were known for. The farm was his lifeline, and though the profits were thin, it gave him something the city never had: space to breathe. That afternoon, the sky stretched wide and colorless, the horizon blurred by dust. Ethan paused when he thought he heard something unusual, an uneven rhythm that didn't belong to the wind or the crickets. At first, he dismissed it as a branch scraping against another, but then it came again. A faint, shuddering sound, like labored breathing. He followed the noise, his boots sinking into softer ground near the neglected parcel of land beyond the old oak grove. And that was when he saw it. At first, it was only a pale shimmer against the dark bark of a lone oak tree, standing apart like a sentinel. Ethan squinted, and his heart stumbled in his chest. A horse, no, a wild mustang, stood there, tethered cruelly to the trunk with a length of rusted chain. Its coat, once white, was dulled by dust and streaked with sweat. The animal's head hung low, its flanks heaving, foam crusting around its lips. Ethan froze, not out of fear, but out of shock. He had seen injured animals before, calves trapped in barbed wire, stray dogs limping on broken legs. But this was different. There was a stillness in the horse's posture that was not natural, not free. It was the stillness of defeat. He stepped closer, careful, his breath catching when the mustang lifted its head. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Ethan felt an unexpected jolt, as if someone had placed a mirror in front of his chest. In those dark, trembling eyes, he saw not just fear, but a hollow loneliness that echoed his own. The wind shifted, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood. Ethan's gaze dropped to the horse's neck where the chain had rubbed raw patches of skin, exposing angry welts. Scars traced across its flanks, long, deliberate, almost like someone had carved symbols instead of wounds. He swallowed hard, the back of his throat dry. "God Almighty," he whispered, his voice rough with disbelief. "What happened to you?" The mustang flinched at the sound, pulling against the chain with a sharp clatter of links. Its nostrils flared, and for a moment Ethan thought it would collapse from the effort. Instinct told him to retreat, but compassion rooted him in place. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of surrender. "It's all right," he murmured, his words carried on the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you." The horse's chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. Its ears twitched, torn between panic and exhaustion. Ethan took another cautious step, his boots sinking into the earth softened by years of neglect. The chain creaked, and the horse tossed its head, foam flecking the air. Every scar, every shiver cut into Ethan's heart. He thought of his wife in the last days, her hands frail, her breathing shallow, the way she had looked at him as though asking for a rescue he couldn't give. That helplessness had carved its own scar across his soul, and here it was again, staring back at him from a creature bound to a tree. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to make his presence less threatening. The horse blinked, one step back from collapse. Ethan's eyes softened, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be alone like this. No one should." For a moment, the world around them seemed to hush. The rattle of corn stalks faded, and the clearing was suspended in a silence that felt sacred. Then, the mustang released a sound, half snort, half sigh, as though something inside it recognized the truth in his words. Ethan didn't move closer. He simply remained there, steady as the old oak, letting the horse see that he wasn't a threat. The chain gleamed in the fading light, cruel and heavy, a reminder of someone else's choice to hurt what should have been wild and free. He knew he couldn't walk away. The last rays of sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and Ethan, with a breath that trembled more than he would admit, said softly to the horse, "I'll call you Ash, because that's what you look like." Burned down to nothing, but still standing, Ash flicked its ears, weary but listening. Ethan stepped one pace closer, slow as prayer, as the Kansas wind carried away his final words of the day. "You're not alone anymore." The words drifted out of Ethan's mouth and seemed to hang beneath the oak canopy, as if even the leaves had paused to listen. Ash stood very still. The mustang's ears moved like twin needles, stitching uncertainty to hope, forward, then back, then forward again. In the glass, dark eyes, Ethan saw a depth that books and sermons had never given him, an old, aching wisdom. He didn't step closer. He let the silence do the work. A breeze lifted dry grass and carried the smell of dust and distant wood smoke. From the county road, a truck rattled past and faded, leaving only the soft knock of chain against bark whenever Ash shifted weight. The sound made Ethan flinch. He hated the way it cut through everything. Bird song, his pulse, even the memory of his wife's laugh, as if suffering had its own metronome. "Easy," he said, and the word came out gentler than he expected. Ash lowered his head a fraction. The big chest rose and fell with a shuddering rhythm. Spittle crusted in pale flakes at the corners of the mouth. Ethan kept his breathing slow, matching it to the wind. He remembered what an old hand once told him about working with animals. If you want calm, lend yours first. Minutes passed like the long shadow of a cloud. Ethan studied the pattern of the chain so he wouldn't have to study the scars. He traced with his eyes the way the links wrapped twice around the trunk before disappearing behind Ash's jaw. Whoever had done it knew how to make a knot that didn't give. He could loosen it, maybe, with time and leverage, or he could come back with the right tool. Not tonight. Not with the light thinning and the temperature dropping. He took 2 careful steps sideways, not forward. Ash followed him with that steady, grave gaze. Ethan stopped when the mustang's skin rippled. Only a tremor, a warning, the way a field lifts before a storm. "All right," he murmured, I'll keep my distance. He tugged off his glove, rummaged in his pocket, and drew out a small apple he'd tucked there at noon. It had warmed against his body and smelled faintly of sun and sugar. He placed the apple on a flat rock a few feet inside Ash's reach, then stepped back to where the grass was uncrushed. He didn't look at the horse. He listened to the wind, the fence wire humming softly somewhere behind him, the tick of seed pods knocking together like beads. A few heartbeats later, he heard it. A tentative scrape of hoof, a slow exhale, the careful clack of teeth. Ethan let a smile live on the inside of his mouth where Ash couldn't see it. Food was not trust. But it was a beginning, the kind you respected by not celebrating. Dusk bled into the low places first. The oak trunk darkened to iron, and the Mustang's white coat lost its edges until Ash became a pale shape, stitched to the tree by shadow. Ethan checked the sky. He knew better than to work blind with metal and a frightened animal. He also knew better than to leave a living soul alone without water. "I'll be right back," he said, words meant for himself as much as for Ash. And he walked the fence line to the gate. He didn't turn his back. He angled away like a man easing his way out of a hard conversation. At the truck, he found the blue plastic bucket he used for mineral, supplements, and a coil of nylon rope. He filled the bucket at the frost-free spigot near the windbreak, then slung it carefully, and returned, keeping his steps unhurried, his silhouette small. Ash tensed at the slosh, nostrils flaring. "It's only water," Ethan said. He set the bucket down beyond the arc of the chain, where the Mustang could reach if courage outpaced fear. He stepped away, counting slow. 1, 2, 3. At 7, Ash moved. The first sip was almost ceremonial. Lips touching, lifting away, touching again. Then the dam broke, and the horse drank deep, eyes half closed, as if the taste of clean water could rinse the day out of its bones. Watching, Ethan felt a pressure ease behind his ribs. The farm would need him up before dawn. Feed the heifers, call the supplier about seed, look at the combine belt that had been squealing. But all of it fell into a quiet, second place. He thought, not for the first time, about the ledger he kept in his desk drawer, numbers marching with blunt honesty across the pages, property taxes, a note on the tractor, the stingy miracle of his best savings account earning just enough to make him feel both prudent and poor. He'd switched farm insurance 2 summers ago to keep the bank from fussing about coverage, bundling home insurance and car insurance together because the agent promised it would optimize cash flow. Maybe it had. Maybe it hadn't. What he knew was this. Some choices, though expensive, were simple. Bring water. Bring patience. Come back tomorrow with help. He walked the perimeter of the clearing once, memorizing the ground. There were 2 obvious paths in, both rutted. No fresh boot prints he could see, but the soil was hard, the kind of baked clay that refused to confess. Still, the chain and the scars said enough. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had claimed a wild thing and decided pain was a kind of handwriting. "Whoever you belonged to," he said softly. "They were wrong." The Mustang lifted its head from the bucket and blinked at him over the rim. A crescent of water glistened on the lower lip before falling soundlessly back. Evening had finished its work. The world around them was violet and thin. Coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the north pasture, a sound as old as the plains, and Ash's ears swung toward it, then back, the way a soldier keeps two clocks running in the same room. Ethan eased to the base of the oak and leaned his shoulder against it, leaving 3 good yards of air between himself and the horse. The bark pressed into his shirt like a memory of hard work. He felt the day settle over him and thought of the house waiting. 1 mug on the counter, 1 chair pulled out, 1 quilt folded neatly but never warm. He remembered, as clearly as he remembered the layout of his fields, the night the doctor said there was nothing left to do but comfort. He had poured coffee he didn't need and sat on the edge of the bed, counting her breaths the way he now counted Ash's. After, the house had made a new sound. Not silence, not grief, but the small echo of a life moving around the space where another life used to be. "You look like you know that sound," he said. "Maybe that's why you didn't run." A star appeared, and then another. The last light clung to Ash's mane, catching on the tangles, turning them to pale thread. The Mustang shifted a hoof. The chain answered with a quiet, metallic answer, less a rattle now than a tired sigh. Ethan slid down the trunk until he was sitting, knees up, forearms draped over them. He did not watch Ash directly. He watched the wind use the grass like soft brush strokes. He let his own breathing go easy again, and when he spoke, it was as if he were talking to the earth. "I'll come back in the morning with a cutter," he said. "We'll do this the right way. No hurry, no surprises." He stayed until the cold found the cracks in his jacket. Once, Ash took a step toward him, then changed his mind and returned to the bucket, as if choosing thirst over trust was the safer habit. Ethan respected that. Habits keep you alive until they don't. He stood slowly, joints announcing themselves. He picked up the empty apple core where the Mustang had dropped it and put it in his pocket. A small, ordinary act, carrying away what was used up. At the edge of the clearing, he paused and looked back. In the low light, Ash seemed larger, not smaller, less an animal than a story the land was telling back to itself. Ethan tipped his cap, a farmer's quiet salute, and walked out into the dark, following the fence line by feel. At the truck, he sat with his hands on the wheel for a long minute before starting the engine. He didn't turn on the radio. He let the night fill the cab like a benediction. When he pulled into the yard, the porch light caught the dust on his boots and turned it silver. He rinsed the bucket and set it by the door. Inside, the house accepted him without drama. He warmed leftover stew, ate standing, and washed the bowl. He wrote 3 words on a sticky note and pressed it to the front of the fridge where he'd see it in the morning. Bolt cutter. Rope. He added, after a moment's thought, another line. Call Grace. He hadn't seen the new vet more than twice, once when a heifer calved hard, and once when she gave a talk at the co-op about pasture rotation and parasites. She spoke like someone who believed information was a form of kindness. He respected that too. Maybe she'd know what to do with scars that looked like maps to a place no one should go. Maybe she'd say, "You're doing fine. Go slow. Be steady." He could use the echo. Before bed, he stepped out onto the porch and listened. The coyotes were quiet now. A faint, steady wind came off the fields and carried the oak's secret back to him. Water and chain, breath and leaf. He closed his eyes and pictured Ash exactly where he'd left the Mustang. He didn't let his mind write other possibilities. Worry was a plow that turned the same furrow until you had nothing but dust. Sleep was clumsy, but came. He dreamed of stubble fields washed clean by rain, of a white horse walking out of fog, of a hand, his, lowering a chain into grass and letting it vanish there, swallowed by the earth like any other old thing given back. When the alarm went off at 5, the dream didn't shatter. It dimmed and waited. Ethan brewed strong coffee and drank it black, while the horizon thought about light. He put the bolt cutter in the truck bed next to a folded blanket, a halter he wasn't sure he would need, and the blue bucket. He called the vet's office and left a message that was nothing but the facts and a time. On the table, his ledger sat open to a page where the columns didn't quite add up. He closed the book gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping room. Out by the gate, he stopped with his hand on the latch and looked toward the oak grove. The wind had shifted overnight. It came now from the north, cooler and clean. He imagined Ash lifting his head at the same moment, ears turning to a familiar sound. Boots, careful on frosted grass. He imagined the water, a small coin of light inside the bucket. He imagined the chain, old and stubborn, ready to argue, ready to lose. He smiled, a private thing, and said it again, this time to the morning. Today, he promised. The chain comes off. The dawn came pale and cold, as if the sun were hesitant to rise over Kansas that morning. Ethan Walker drove the old pickup along the fence line, the bolt cutter rattling in the truck bed, the blue bucket rolling slightly with each bump. The air smelled of frost and dry earth, a blend of endings and beginnings. He sipped from the coffee thermos wedged beside him, its bitterness grounding him more than the caffeine ever could. At the edge of the grove, he cut the engine and listened. Birds stirred in the branches, cautious notes like questions. Beyond them, silence. Then, faintly, the familiar rhythm. Ash breathing, uneven but alive. Relief swept over Ethan so sharp it almost hurt. He stepped out, boots crunching in frost, and walked toward the oak tree. Ash was still there, head lifted, ears pricked. The Mustang had drunk the water, the bucket tipped on its side. Dried mud crusted its muzzle where it had nosed the ground for any leftover moisture. Ethan noticed the apple core was gone too, vanished into the hunger of the night. He nodded once, quietly pleased. "Morning," he said, his voice low, respectful, as if entering a church. The Mustang stamped a hoof, the chain answering with its cruel rattle. Ethan's jaw tightened. He set the bucket down, filled now with fresh water, and laid the folded blanket on the grass. Then he lifted the bolt cutter, its steel jaws glinting in the new sun. Ash flinched, muscles quivering, and Ethan froze. "It's not what it looks like," he murmured. "This one's here to help," he said. Knelt, making himself smaller, placing the tool on the ground within reach, but not raising it again. Patience had always been his currency. On the farm, with the seasons, with grief. He let the quiet stretch until the Mustang's eyes softened just enough for him to breathe again. Moving carefully, he traced the line of the chain to where it bit into bark. The links were thick, rust seeping into the grooves, sharp edges biting at Ash's skin. It was no ordinary tether. This had been made for confinement, not care. He positioned the cutter over the first link and paused. "It'll be loud," he whispered. "Bear with me." The blades closed with a sharp snap that echoed through the clearing. Ash startled, jerking back, but the chain held. Ethan steadied himself, waiting until the tremor in the horse's chest eased. Then he moved to the next section, his breath slow, his hands steady. Snap. Another link fell, heavy against the roots. Piece by piece, the chain surrendered. With each cut, Ethan felt a strange pressure lift inside his own chest, as if he were dismantling more than metal. Sweat dampened his collar despite the chill air, and when at last the final loop fell free, Ash staggered a step, nostrils flaring wide. "You're free," Ethan said. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than he expected. He stepped back, lowering the cutter, letting the horse decide. Ash didn't bolt. The mustang stood trembling, head high, as though the open space around its neck was too vast to comprehend. For a long moment, it simply breathed, the chain coiled uselessly on the ground like a shed skin. Ethan stayed still. He knew freedom could be frightening. He had lived through that truth himself. When his wife died, people told him he was free to rebuild his life, to move forward. Instead, he had felt unmoored, exposed to winds too strong to face. Freedom wasn't relief. It was bewilderment. And in Ash's hesitation, he saw the same storm. At last, the horse stepped forward, one careful hoof on the grass beyond the oak's shade. Another step followed, cautious but certain. Ethan let his breath go, a quiet exhale of gratitude. The mustang walked a slow circle, then stopped to look back at him. That look struck Ethan harder than the chain's bite had. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Just live." The morning sun broke clean over the horizon, washing the clearing in gold. Ash's coat caught the light, pale and raw where scars crossed the skin. Some were long-heeled, silvery against the hide. Others were fresh, still angry. Ethan couldn't ignore them. These were not marks of the wild. They were deliberate, intentional. Symbols, perhaps, or numbers. He felt his stomach twist. He crouched, fingertips brushing one of the fallen links. The rust stained his skin red-brown, like dried blood. Whoever had done this hadn't simply tied a horse for convenience. They had meant it as punishment, or worse, as ownership. Ash lifted his head suddenly, ears swiveling toward the horizon. Ethan followed the gaze, but saw nothing. Only endless fields, distant fences, the shimmer of heat beginning to rise. Still, the mustang's tension unnerved him. Animals didn't react without reason. He tucked the bolt cutter under his arm, gathered the chain into a loose pile, and decided to leave it hidden. Better not to advertise what had been done here. He backed away slowly, never turning his back, until he reached the truck. Ash remained by the oak, poised between retreat and curiosity. Before climbing in, Ethan lifted a hand. "I'll come back." With help. The drive home felt different, the fields unfamiliar, as though he were carrying an unspoken secret heavier than steel. In town, he would need supplies, more oats, better tools. And he would need to call Grace Miller, the vet. Her voice at the co-op meeting had stayed with him. Calm, precise, but kind. She might understand the meaning of scars shaped like letters. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan unloaded the chain onto the barn floor. The sound echoed through the beams like thunder. He covered it with an old tarp, unwilling to leave it where curious eyes might wander. Then he wrote again in his notebook. Ash. Scars patterned. Ask Grace. The rest of the day blurred with farm chores, feeding cattle, checking irrigation lines, but every task felt muted, like shadows of themselves. His mind circled back to the clearing, to the image of Ash stepping free, yet looking back, as if asking what freedom meant now. That evening, when the sun bled red across the horizon, Ethan found himself back on the porch, staring toward the grove, though it was miles away. He felt something loosen inside him, a thread pulling taut, then breaking. He whispered into the dusk, "Tomorrow, we start again." And though the words faded into night, he knew Ash carried them too. Ethan Walker had never been a man of noise. His neighbors often said they could set their watches by his routine. Lights on before dawn, tractor engine turning at first light, porch dark by 9 o'clock at night. Silence had been his companion long before his wife's passing, but now it pressed heavier, filling corners of the house that once rang with laughter or the hum of an old radio she loved to keep on. In that stillness, Ethan found both refuge and ache. He had learned to live inside it, to measure his days not by what was said, but by what was done. The morning after he cut Ash free, Ethan walked his farm as he always did. He checked the troughs, scattered feed for the heifers, and tested the fences for weak spots. Yet every step felt different, as if the rhythm of the land had shifted with the snap of that rusted chain. His hands carried out their work, but his mind lingered on the oak grove, wondering whether Ash was still there, or had vanished into the wide sweep of the plains. At breakfast, he set 2 mugs on the counter before catching himself. He placed one back in the cupboard. It was an old habit that refused to die, the small act of reaching for her mug, the one with faded sunflowers. He ate in silence, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl the only sound. The quiet pressed harder that day, demanding his attention. He had lived with loneliness, but Ash's dark eyes had unsettled the balance. They had spoken back to him, reflected something he thought only humans could share. By mid-morning, he was back at the barn. The pile of chain lay beneath a tarp, hidden but not forgotten. Ethan stared at it, as if it could answer questions. Who had left Ash like that? What purpose did those carved scars serve? He ran a hand over the steel jaws of the bolt cutter resting nearby, then turned away. He didn't want to let anger take root. He had lived long enough to know rage was an expensive crop. It grew fast and consumed everything around it. Instead, he poured himself into small tasks. He replaced worn boards in the chicken coop, oiled the squeaking hinges of the gate, and swept the dust from the workshop. Work was language to him, each task a sentence, each completion a period. Yet no matter how many chores he strung together, the silence seemed to expand. When he finally sat on the porch in the late afternoon, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, his eyes drifted instinctively toward the distant grove. He thought of Ash then, how the horse had taken its first halting steps into freedom, only to pause, looking back. It reminded Ethan too much of himself in the months after his wife's funeral. Friends had told him he should travel, join church gatherings, visit his sister in Colorado. He had nodded politely, but each time he tried to step out of the shadow of grief, he turned back. The house, the farm, the routines, they were chains of their own, but familiar ones. He understood Ash's hesitation with a clarity that stung. As evening fell, Ethan lit the single lamp in the living room and pulled out the small notebook where he kept reminders. He added a line beneath yesterday's note. Grace Miller, call. He hesitated, pen hovering. He wasn't a man who asked for help easily, yet those scars had unsettled him. They weren't the marks of survival in the wild. They were signatures of cruelty, deliberate and systematic. He didn't need answers for himself. He needed them for the mustang who had endured them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ethan stepped outside. The moon hung low, a silver coin above the dark sweep of fields. He stood on the porch, listening. The night was alive with crickets, a far-off owl, the faint rustle of leaves. And there, so faint he almost doubted, came a sound he recognized now. The low, rhythmic breathing of a horse, carried by the wind. He held his breath, searching the dark edges of the yard, and thought he caught a glimpse of pale movement near the tree line. Ash had not run. Something shifted in Ethan's chest then. Not a loud revelation, but a quiet rearrangement. The farm no longer felt entirely empty. The silence had company, even if it stood at a distance. He whispered into the night, "Stay if you want. I won't ask more." The wind carried his words into the dark, where they dissolved like seeds scattered across the earth. Back inside, Ethan lay awake for hours, not restless, but listening to the silence differently. It wasn't a void anymore. It had a presence, a rhythm beyond his own. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the coming dawn. He almost welcomed it, wondering what it might bring, not for himself, but for the wounded mustang who had already rewritten the shape of his solitude. Saturday mornings in the small town of Clearwater always carried a particular rhythm. The grain elevator hummed at the edge of town. The diner filled early with the smell of bacon and coffee, and farmers lingered on the sidewalks outside the feed store to trade news that was part gossip, part survival. Ethan Walker seldom stayed long. He bought what he needed, offered a quiet nod to familiar faces, and returned to the solitude of his farm. But this morning, something tugged at him to linger. Maybe it was the restless thought of Ash, or maybe the scars burned too vividly in his memory. Either way, he parked the truck along Main Street, slid his hat lower, and walked toward the store with the blue and white awning that sold everything from seed to saddle soap. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of molasses cubes and alfalfa pellets stacked in burlap sacks. Ethan gathered oats, a salt block, and a few tools he'd postponed buying. At the counter, he asked quietly about a bulk order. The clerk, a young man with freckles, nodded and scribbled notes. But before Ethan could leave, he caught the sound of a voice behind him, female, steady, carrying a tone of practiced patience. "Mr. Walker?" He turned. Grace Miller stood there, hair tied back in a simple braid, a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She was younger than he remembered from the co-op meeting, perhaps mid-30s, though her eyes carried the fatigue of someone who worked long days in barns and fields. She smiled, not the forced kind, but one that folded into the corners of her eyes. "I heard you left a message," she said. "About a horse." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a man who shared easily, not even with neighbors he'd known all his life. But something about Grace's calm demeanor disarmed him. He nodded once. "Out by the oak grove on the edge of my property." Wild one, chained, scarred. Her smile faded, replaced by concern. Scarred how? He described them as best he could, lines that weren't random, marks too deliberate to be the result of brush or barbed wire. Grace's brow furrowed. She had seen injuries of all kinds, but her silence told him these were different. "I'll come out this afternoon," she said. "I want to see for myself." As they spoke, Ethan noticed Sheriff Tom Hardy push through the door. Tom carried himself with the easy authority of a man who had been in uniform for decades, his badge dulled by wear, his hat settled like it belonged there. He greeted a few locals, then spotted Ethan and Grace. His expression shifted to curiosity, then caution. "Morning, Ethan." "Grace." "Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice low. Tom stepped closer. "I couldn't help overhearing. You found a horse out by your grove?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The sheriff had been his friend once, but grief and time had loosened the bond. Still, he respected the man's integrity. "Yes," he admitted. "Chain around its neck. Didn't look like an accident." Tom's eyes narrowed. He leaned against the counter, voice lowering. "There have been rumors. Illegal races, out-of-state money. Nothing proven, but if your horse has scars the way you describe, it may be tied to something ugly." Grace crossed her arms. "Then we need to act quickly. That horse needs medical care. It's malnourished, exhausted, traumatized." The sheriff looked between them. "Ethan, you understand. If what you've found is connected, whoever left it there might come back, and they won't like seeing their property in someone else's hands." Ethan's jaw tightened at the word property. "It's no one's property," he said. Tom nodded slowly. "I don't disagree. But men who see animals as profit don't care about what's right. Keep your eyes open." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Ethan's mind was no longer on the store or the oats stacked at his feet. He pictured Ash, standing alone near the oak grove, skin scored by symbols only cruelty would carve. He imagined headlights cutting across the pasture at night, strangers searching for what they believed belonged to them. The thought filled him with quiet dread and a stubborn resolve. When he returned to his farm, the day had stretched wide and hot, the wind carrying the dry smell of cut hay. He stored the supplies, then stood on the porch, staring toward the grove. From this distance, he couldn't see Ash, but he felt the horse's presence. He thought of Grace's promise to come that afternoon, and Tom's warning that danger might follow. He spoke aloud, though no one could hear. "If they come for you, they'll have to come through me." The words lingered, carried off by the wind across the stubble fields. Inside, Ethan brewed another pot of coffee, his hands steady, his mind sharper than it had been in years. He had lived quiet for too long. Now, with Ash tethered not by chains but by need, he understood. His silence was no longer enough. The afternoon sun burned low over the Kansas fields when Ethan heard the sound of bicycle tires crunching along the gravel road. He was standing by the barn, stacking the last of the hay bales he'd hauled from a neighbor's lot, when he saw the boy. Lucas rode a battered blue bike too small. For his long legs, a baseball cap turned backward on his head. He braked hard at the gate, dust rising around him like smoke, and leaned against the post, breathing quick from the uphill stretch. "Mr. Walker," Lucas called, voice carrying the mix of boldness and hesitation only a teenager could manage. "You need help with those bales?" Ethan shaded his eyes, studying the boy. 14, maybe, with dark hair sticking to his forehead, and eyes too old for his age. He'd seen Lucas around before, running errands for neighbors, mowing lawns, hauling groceries for the diner. Always busy, always looking for ways to earn a few dollars since his father's accident last winter. The town still whispered about it. A truck jackknifed on the highway, a life gone too soon, and a boy left to fill shoes too large. "You don't owe me work," Ethan said. Lucas shrugged. "Doesn't mean I don't want it. Besides, Mom says I should keep busy." The boy set the bike against the fence and jogged over, hands reaching instinctively for the twine-wrapped bale Ethan was about to lift. They worked in silence for a while, Ethan guiding the rhythm, Lucas straining to match the weight. Sweat soaked through the boy's t-shirt, but he never complained. When the last bale slid into place, Lucas wiped his forehead with his sleeve and gave a grin too quick, too practiced, like he'd learned to use it as a shield. "You got animals I don't see?" Lucas asked, glancing around the quiet farmyard. Ethan paused, considering how much to share. At the grove, Ash still lingered. He hadn't taken Grace out yet, not with the heat pressing down and the Mustang's nerves stretched tight. "Not animals," Ethan said slowly. "One horse, wild, found him chained in the woods." Lucas's grin faded. "Chained? Like someone tied him up?" "Exactly that." The boy's eyes darkened, the grin gone. "That's messed up." Something in his voice told Ethan he knew more about being bound than he should at his age. He wondered how much of Lucas's grief was carried quietly, disguised in work and bravado. The boy leaned on the fence rail, staring out toward the grove. "Can I see him?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Not too close." "He's skittish." They walked the field path together. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and cut grass. At the edge of the grove, Ash stood in partial shadow, head lifting at their approach. The horse's coat gleamed dully in the slant of light, scars catching the eye like cracks in porcelain. Lucas stopped, breath catching audibly. "Whoa," he whispered. Ash snorted, ears flicking forward. The boy didn't move closer, only watched. His face softened in a way Ethan hadn't expected, eyes reflecting something more than curiosity. There was recognition there, an unspoken kinship. The silence stretched until Lucas spoke again, his voice quiet. "He looks lost." Ethan glanced at him. "That's one word for it." Lucas stood straighter, shoulders squaring as if to prove himself. "I could help?" "Animals like me. Mom says I've got away with them." Ash tossed his head, stepping back, but didn't bolt. The boy stayed still, hands loose at his sides, eyes steady. Ethan felt a shift in the air, a thread of connection weaving between the boy and the Mustang. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something undeniable. As dusk bled into the grove, Lucas finally stepped back. "If you let me come around sometimes, I won't tell anyone." "Promise." Ethan studied him, reading the lines of grief written in the boy's posture, the quiet determination that came from carrying too much, too soon. He thought of how Ash had looked at him that first night, broken but unyielding, and he realized Lucas carried that same look. "Come by tomorrow," Ethan said at last. "But you follow my lead." "That horse has been hurt enough." Lucas nodded fiercely, as if the offer had given him something he hadn't dared hope for. He grabbed his bike, pedaling off down the gravel road, a figure small against the broad Kansas horizon. Ethan lingered at the fence, watching Ash shift in the fading light. He felt the weight of new responsibility settling on him, not just for the horse, not just for himself, but for a boy who had lost a father, and a horse who had lost his freedom. Somehow, they had both found their way here, to his farm, to his silence. And in that silence, Ethan thought, maybe they could all learn how to stand again. The rain came sudden, rolling across the plains in sheets that blurred the horizon. Ethan had been fixing a section of fence when the first drops fell, fat and cold, drumming against the brim of his hat. He considered running for shelter, but something in him hesitated. The grove was only a short walk away, and his thoughts had been circling Ash all morning. He left the tools in the grass and headed down the muddy path. Ash stood at the edge of the grove, mane plastered to his neck, sides trembling from the storm's surprise. The Mustang's head shot up as Ethan appeared, ears flicking nervously. The chain was gone, but freedom had not yet erased the wariness. Each flash of lightning made Ash flinch, every thunderclap a reminder of captivity's echo. Ethan stopped a good distance away. He lowered his hood, letting the rain soak his hair and run into his collar. "It's just weather," he murmured. "Nothing chasing you now." His words were swallowed by the storm, but the tone carried. From behind, he heard footsteps squelching in the mud. Lucas had followed on foot, bike abandoned at the lane when the rain began. The boy's cheeks were flushed, his clothes damp, but his eyes lit up when he saw the horse. "He stayed," Lucas said, almost in awe. Ash shifted, uneasy with two humans instead of one. Ethan held out an arm, motioning the boy to slow down. Together they stood, letting the rain fall, giving Ash space to decide. Minutes stretched, measured only by the rhythm of drops against leaves. Then something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. Ash lowered his head. His ears flicked forward instead of back. Ethan took a careful step. His boots sank into the mud, water rising over the soles. He kept his arms loose, his shoulders rounded. The horse's eyes followed, wide, but no longer burning with panic. Another step, then another. He stopped just within arm's reach, close enough to feel the heat of the animal's breath mixing with the mist. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered. His hand hovered in the space between them, palm open, waiting. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Ash leaned forward, muzzle quivering, nostrils flaring. The touch came as a brush of damp whiskers against calloused skin. A shiver ran through Ethan's body. Not of cold, but of something older. Something breaking open inside him. Lucas gasped softly, his voice breaking with excitement. "He let you... He actually..." "Shh," Ethan said gently, eyes never leaving the Mustang. "Don't scare him off." Ash lingered for only a moment, then pulled back, stamping the ground as if embarrassed by his own boldness. But he didn't run. He stayed near, ears twitching, as if reconsidering what trust might mean. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, letting the moment rest between them. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, softer now, washing dust from the Mustang's coat until scars stood out stark and raw. Ethan studied them closely for the first time in this new proximity. They weren't random. Some curved in deliberate arcs, others etched straight lines across muscle. Numbers, maybe. Symbols. A language of cruelty. His throat tightened. He thought of his wife's handwriting, loops of ink in letters she left on the kitchen table. Those had been symbols of love, tiny anchors in the chaos of his days. These marks on Ash were the opposite, a record of someone's ownership, someone's violence. He clenched his jaw, forcing his breath steady so the horse wouldn't feel the anger radiating from him. Lucas, too, had gone quiet. His small hands gripped the fence post, knuckles white. "Who would do that?" he asked softly, almost as if he didn't want an answer. Ethan had none to give. Not yet. The rain lightened to a mist, the air rich with the smell of wet earth. Ethan stepped back, giving Ash space again. The Mustang shook himself, water flying in droplets that glittered briefly in the weak light. Then, as if satisfied with the exchange, He moved to the water bucket Ethan had left earlier, drinking deep. Lucas turned to Ethan, his face shining with something between hope and awe. "He touched you. Next time, maybe me?" "Maybe," Ethan said, though his voice carried caution. Trust takes time. They walked back to the farmhouse together, boots squelching, mud streaking their legs. Lucas chattered softly, already planning the next visit, the next chance. Ethan half listened, his mind lingering on the brief touch, the electric recognition that had passed from animal to man. It had been years since he'd let himself feel something so immediate, so alive. That night, alone in the farmhouse, he dried his boots by the stove and sat staring at his hand. The skin there still seemed to hold the ghost of the mustang's breath. He thought of how fragile the moment had been, how easily it could have broken. And he knew he had crossed a threshold, not just with the horse, but with himself. For the first time in a long while, Ethan whispered a prayer before bed. Not for answers, not for miracles, just thanks. For rain, for survival, for a horse who had chosen not to run. The following afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving the fields rinsed clean and the air sharp with the scent of wet grass. Ethan stood on the porch, boots still damp from the night before, watching a hawk wheel lazy arcs over the far pasture. His hand, still remembering the heat of Ash's breath, ached to reach again, though he knew trust wasn't something earned in a single touch. Patience was the only currency he had to offer. Grace Miller's old station wagon rattled up the gravel drive just past noon. She stepped out in mud-caked boots, carrying her leather bag, her braid damp from the lingering mist. She looked at Ethan with a question already in her eyes. "Where is he?" Ethan led her down the narrow path toward the oak grove. Lucas appeared halfway there, jogging from the lane with his bike thrown carelessly in the ditch. "I wanted to be here," the boy said, breathless. Ethan considered sending him home, but something in Lucas's gaze, an unspoken loyalty, kept him silent. Ash waited near the clearing, his coat still streaked with rainwater. When he spotted the small group approaching, his muscles tensed, but he did not bolt. Grace stopped several yards short, assessing with a practiced eye. "He's a mustang," she murmured, "and a rare one." "White like that, out here?" Her words trailed off as she noticed the marks. Ethan had seen them in flashes, lines and arcs that seemed too deliberate, but Grace studied them with the scrutiny of a surgeon. She moved slowly around the perimeter, careful not to close the distance too quickly. Ash's ears tracked her every step, but his hooves stayed planted. "Look here," she said softly, beckoning Ethan closer. On the horse's flank, scars crisscrossed in jagged patterns. Some healed pale, others raw and red. Grace lifted a hand but stopped short of touching, out of respect. "These aren't accidents." They were carved. Repeatedly, Lucas's face went pale. "Carved? You mean someone did this on purpose?" Grace nodded grimly. "Yes, and not randomly. See these angles? They're almost symmetrical, here. It looks like a number. And this, like a symbol." Ethan's chest tightened. The idea that someone had turned pain into a language filled him with quiet fury. "Why?" he asked, though the word came out rougher than intended. Grace hesitated before answering. "I've heard stories. Illegal races, sometimes fights, horses marked for betting. They're given identifiers carved into their hides so gamblers know which one is theirs." Lucas clenched his fists, his jaw trembling. That's sick. Ethan kept his voice steady for the boy's sake, though his own thoughts churned. He remembered the sheriff's warning in town, whispers of out-of-state money. Now the rumors had a body, a witness scarred with proof. Ash snorted and shifted, uneasy with the sudden intensity in their posture. Grace stepped back, lowering her tone. He's been through hell. But he's standing here. That says something. The three of them lingered, watching the mustang graze cautiously near the edge of the clearing. Every movement revealed another scar, each one like a paragraph in a story no one wanted to read. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing on him, not just as a farmer or caretaker, but as a man who had known loss etched into his own life. His wife's absence had been invisible, but it had carved him all the same. Lucas finally spoke, his voice tight. He shouldn't have to carry that alone. Grace looked at the boy with surprise, then at Ethan. He's right. But healing isn't about erasing. It's about what comes after. Ethan nodded slowly. He thought of the long nights after the funeral, the silence that had almost swallowed him whole, and how simply surviving each dawn had been its own rebellion. Maybe that's what Ash was doing now, surviving, even when marked. As the sun dipped lower, Grace packed her bag, her expression still shadowed by what she had seen. I'll bring salve for the wounds that are still fresh. We can ease the pain, though the scars will stay. Ethan looked once more at the mustang. Ash had lifted his head, meeting his gaze across the distance. The horse's eyes were deep, not pleading, not accusing, only bearing witness. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, an acknowledgement of their shared truth. On the walk back, Lucas kicked at the wet earth, his voice low. Mr. Walker, we can't let them take him back, can we? Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought of the chain hidden under the tarp in his barn, the sheriff's warning, Grace's grim analysis. He thought of Ash's scars and the weight they carried. Finally, he spoke, voice rough but steady. Not while I've got breath in me. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, and nodded as if it were an oath they now shared. Grace walked silently beside them, the storm clouds parting just enough to let a sliver of light spill over the fields. Ethan felt the shift again. Small, quiet, but undeniable. Ash was no longer just a horse chained to a tree. He was a witness, a survivor, and perhaps the start of something larger than any of them could yet name. The 4th of July had always been a date Ethan Walker endured or then celebrated. Long after his wife's passing, he still sat out the town parade and the carnival rides, preferring the quiet of his porch to the noise of Main Street. But this year, with Lucas spending more and more time around the farm and Ash lingering at the grove, he couldn't entirely escape the day. Clearwater was a small town. When fireworks lit the sky, you heard them no matter how far you tried to hide. By late afternoon, Ethan had finished chores and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the page of his notebook where he had written a short list. Check fences. Feed calves. Bring oats to Ash. He'd ticked every item but the last. Through the open window, he caught the faint sound of kids laughing on the road, firecrackers already popping like gunfire against the blue distance. He felt his shoulders tighten at each crack. Lucas appeared just before dusk, his bike chain rattling as he skidded into the yard. They're setting up at the high school field, the boy said breathlessly, as if Ethan cared. Then, softer, do you think Ash will be okay with the noise? Ethan looked toward the grove, worry already sitting in his chest. Horses don't take to fireworks, he said. Too close to thunder, too sudden. The first blast came not long after, a golden flower blooming over town, its echo rolling across the plains. Ash reared from the shadows, a pale shape against the trees, nostrils flared wide. Ethan and Lucas were already halfway down the path when the second explosion came, sharper, louder. The Mustang bolted sideways, hooves tearing at the ground. "Easy!" Ethan shouted, though his voice was lost in the noise. Ash crashed against the fence, rattling the posts. His eyes were wide with terror, seeing not light, but memory. The same brutality that had carved his flanks now roared again in the sky. He spun, slamming into the corner, trembling as if the world itself had turned against him. Lucas stopped short, horror etched across his young face. "He's going to hurt himself." Ethan moved closer, his arms out, voice low but firm. "Ash, it's all right. It's only noise. Only light." He had spoken the same words once at a hospital bed, when the machines had beeped and hissed around his wife. He remembered her eyes then, distant with pain but searching for something steady. Now Ash's eyes searched him with that same desperate hunger. Another firework cracked overhead, red sparks raining against the horizon. Ash rammed the fence again, skin splitting on an old scar. Ethan felt the helplessness hit him like a punch, the same helplessness that had hollowed him years before. "Mr. Walker!" Lucas cried, tears in his voice. "Do something!" And then Ethan did something he hadn't done since that hospital night. He let himself break. He stepped into the pen, ignoring the danger, his hands shaking as he reached for the horse. "I couldn't save her," he choked, the words spilling out raw. "I couldn't save her, but I won't lose you too." Ash froze, sides heaving, nostrils dripping foam. The words had no meaning, but the tone carried truth. Ethan's voice cracked again, softer now. "Please, not this time." The Mustang's trembling slowed. Another boom split the sky, yet Ash didn't slam the fence again. Instead, he turned his head, breath hot against Ethan's sleeve. Slowly, impossibly, he lowered it to the farmer's shoulder. The contact was fleeting, fragile as glass, but it held. Lucas stood outside the fence, mouth open, tears cutting clean lines down his muddy cheeks. "He chose you," the boy whispered. The fireworks roared on, exploding in colors Ethan didn't bother to watch. All he saw was the pale body pressed near him, the weight of survival heavy but shared. For a moment he let his own grief pour out. The years of silence, the nights spent with an empty chair, the ache that had never eased. And the horse, scarred and shaking, stood with him in that storm of memory. When the last rocket burned out and the night sank back into quiet, Ash stepped away, still alert, but calmer, his sides damp with sweat. Ethan stroked his neck once, then lowered his hand, breathing hard. Lucas climbed through the fence, his small frame shaking. "I thought he was going to die," he said. "So did I," Ethan admitted. His voice was low, raw but steady now. He glanced at the scars gleaming in the moonlight. But he didn't. Neither of us did. They walked back to the farmhouse together, Ash following a few steps behind, as though tethered by something invisible. The night smelled of smoke and powder, a harsh reminder of what had just passed, but also of survival. Ethan stopped at the porch, looking back at the Mustang waiting in the yard. His heart beat uneven, but with a rhythm that felt more alive than it had in years. He reached out a hand, not to touch this time, but as a promise across the distance. "You're not alone," he said again. And for the first time, He believed it. The week after the fireworks brought a different kind of silence to the farm. It was not the peace of a summer dawn or the quiet that followed long work in the fields. It was heavier, unsettled, like the stillness before a storm. Ethan felt it in the way Ash kept his head high, ears pricked toward the distant road, as if expecting footsteps that never came. He felt it in his own chest, too, a faint pressure that no amount of chores could ease. Clearwater had moved on from the holiday celebrations. The town buzzed again with small talk about crop yields, the price of fuel, and whether rain would hold through August. But whispers had begun to ripple underneath, the kind that never reached newspapers, but traveled faster than truth. At the feed store, Ethan overheard two men muttering about strangers seen on the highway, men who didn't belong, driving trucks with out-of-state plates. In the diner, a ranch hand mentioned someone asking questions about a white horse cut up something fierce. Ethan kept his head down, but the words pressed against him like a brand. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the fields gold, Ethan sat on his porch with Lucas. The boy had been quiet all day, distracted even while hauling water and gathering eggs. Finally, he blurted, "I heard them." At the gas station, two guys talking about a horse. They said they lost one, chained it up somewhere but didn't say where. They laughed about it. His young face darkened with anger. "They're talking about Ash, aren't they?" Ethan's jaw clenched. He had wanted to shield the boy from this, to keep his world no larger than bicycles and part-time work. But Lucas had ears, and worse, he had a heart that couldn't help but attach itself to the scarred mustang. "Could be," Ethan said quietly. "That's why we stay careful." Lucas leaned forward, voice sharp with fear disguised as defiance. "They can't have him back." Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought of Sheriff Tom's warning, of Grace's grim assessment of the scars. Whoever had done this to Ash wouldn't stop because of a fence line or a farmer's stubbornness. They were shadows with money and cruelty behind them, and shadows always came back for what they thought belonged to them. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He found himself on the porch again, rifle leaning against the wall, eyes scanning the tree line. The cicadas sang loudly, drowning out subtler noises, but every crunch of gravel, every snap of a branch twisted his stomach. Ash stood near the barn, a pale sentinel under the moon. The horse seemed to feel it too, that invisible weight pressing from the dark. The next morning, Grace arrived with more salve for Ash's healing wounds. She noticed Ethan's tired eyes and frowned. "You're keeping watch, aren't you?" "Someone has to," he said. Grace shook her head. "You can't do this alone forever. If the people behind those scars come looking, they won't just knock politely." Ethan looked toward the grove where Ash grazed. "Then let them come." Her expression softened, a mix of admiration and worry. "Stubborn as a fence post," she muttered. "But don't mistake stubborn for invincible." That evening, while Ethan repaired a gate on the south pasture, Lucas came running, face pale. "Truck!" he gasped. "Down the road." Two men. They stopped and looked at your fields. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, forcing his voice steady. "You sure?" Lucas nodded fiercely. "Didn't recognize them." Out-of-state plates. Ethan felt the old instinct rise, the one he thought he'd buried after years of working the land instead of fighting its battles. He had been a man of routine, of crops and cattle, of silence. But shadows had returned to his farm, and with them came a truth he could no longer ignore. Ash wasn't just a wounded animal needing shelter. He was a target. And anyone who came for him would find Ethan standing in the way. That night, Ethan laid the rifle across his lap and sat on the porch until dawn, the barrel cool in the early air. He didn't want violence, didn't even like the feel of the weapon in his hands anymore. But he had already chosen to keep the Mustang safe, chosen to keep Lucas's fragile hope alive. When the sun finally broke the horizon, Ash lifted his head from grazing and looked directly at Ethan. It wasn't fear in the horse's eyes this time, nor was it trust. It was something harder to name. An understanding, as if both man and animal knew the road ahead would not be quiet. Ethan nodded once, his voice low but firm. "We'll be ready." The call came just after sunrise. Sheriff Tom's voice on the line was clipped, his tone carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "Ethan," he said, "we found something out near the county line. Old barn off Miller's Creek. Tracks, rope, blood in the dirt. You might want to come?" Ethan hung up without asking why. He already knew. The shadows circling Ash had left a trail. Whether out of arrogance or carelessness, someone had used that barn, and if Tom wanted him there, it meant the matter was close enough to touch his life. He saddled his truck with rope, a lantern, and a coil of quiet determination, then drove the rutted road with Lucas beside him. The boy had refused to stay behind. The barn appeared as a skeleton against the horizon, its roof sagging, boards weathered gray by years of storms. It sat in a hollow surrounded by scrub oak, half hidden from the road, the kind of place you could scream inside and no one would hear. Tom's cruiser was parked by the fence, dust coating its flanks. Grace's station wagon was there too, her bag leaning against the wheel. Inside the barn, the air stank of mildew, rust, and something harsher, fear soaked into wood. Broken planks littered the ground. In the center, a crude ring of trampled dirt bore witness to violence. Ethan saw ropes frayed from struggle, dark stains where hooves had struck, and the outline of a gate that had been reinforced with chain. The silence inside carried echoes, as if the walls themselves remembered screams. Grace crouched near the ring, her face pale but steady. She lifted a shard of wood. It bore grooves, fresh ones, sharp and deliberate. "They tied animals here," she said, "worked them until they broke." Lucas hovered near the doorway, his young shoulders stiff. "Why doesn't anyone stop them?" he asked, voice sharp with anger that didn't match his age. Tom sighed, pulling off his hat. "Because shadows move faster than law. By the time we get a warrant, they vanish. Leave behind places like this." He pointed to the ring. "This isn't a barn anymore. It's an arena." Ethan walked the perimeter, boots crunching on old hay. He stopped at a post where something had been carved. Numbers, faint but visible. His stomach knotted as he traced them with his finger. They were the same shapes burned into Ash's scars. "They marked him here," Ethan said, his voice low. "This is where they made him fight, eh?" The group fell silent. The truth settled heavy in the dust. Ash wasn't just abandoned. He was discarded when he no longer served. Ethan saw it clearly now. The chain on the oak, the carved symbols, the terror in Ash's eyes when fireworks split the sky. It all led back to this barn. Grace straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. He survived it. That's what matters now. He's alive. Lucas looked up at Ethan, eyes burning. "And they can't take him back." Ethan nodded, but inside he felt the cold edge of resolve. Seeing this barn stripped away the last of his doubts. Protecting Ash wasn't just an act of kindness. It was defiance against the people who had turned a wild creature into an instrument of cruelty. Tom placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I don't like to say it, but if they know he's with you, they'll come. Men like that don't forgive losses." "I know," Ethan said simply. They left the barn as the sun climbed, casting long shadows that clung stubbornly to the ground. As they walked back to the vehicles, Lucas lingered behind, staring at the ring of dirt one last time. When he finally joined them, his face was pale but determined. On the drive home, silence stretched between Ethan and the boy. Only when the farmhouse came into view did Lucas speak. "He's not just a horse anymore, is he?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "No, he's a survivor. Same as us." That evening, Ash grazed near the barn on Ethan's land, scars catching the fading light. Ethan leaned on the fence, rifle resting nearby, and thought of the abandoned structure by Miller's Creek. He thought of the symbols carved into Ash's hide, the ring of dirt soaked with memory. And he made a promise that reached deeper than words. "They won't touch you again," he murmured. "Not while I'm standing." The Mustang lifted his head, ears flicking toward him, as if he understood. The days after the discovery of the barn carried a strange weight. Ethan moved through his chores as always, mending fences, checking the cattle, stacking hay, but the images clung to him like burrs, the dirt ring gouged by hooves, the numbers carved into the posts, the stink of blood and mildew. Every time he looked at Ash, he saw not just a horse grazing in the Kansas sun, but a survivor of that place, marked in ways no salve could erase. Ash kept his distance now, as if the trip to the barn had unsettled him too. He still lingered near the grove, close enough to be seen, but when Ethan or Lucas approached, he stepped back. Even Grace, who had spoken gently and moved slowly, could not coax him nearer than a dozen yards. Trust, Ethan realized, was fragile. An ember that flared in one breath and threatened to die in the next. Lucas took the setback hard. One evening, after the boy had helped Ethan carry water buckets to the calves, he lingered on the porch steps, knees pulled to his chest. "It's like he forgot everything," Lucas said. "Like the touch, the fireworks, all of it, gone." Ethan sat beside him, boots creaking against the boards. He wanted to give the boy hope, but honesty weighed heavier. "Trauma isn't a straight line, Lucas. Sometimes it feels like you're moving forward, then one thing pulls you back. It's not forgetting. It's surviving." The boy nodded slowly, though his eyes still held disappointment. He wanted miracles. Ethan, older and scarred in his own way, knew better. That night, the wind rose, carrying the sound of coyotes yipping across the fields. Ash paced along the fence line, restless, his hooves dull against the dirt. Ethan watched from the window, resisting the urge to intervene. The Mustang had to learn that not every sound meant danger, not every shadow carried a chain. Healing, he reminded himself, was as much about waiting as it was about action. The next morning, Ethan decided to try something different. Instead of approaching Ash, he sat in the grass near the grove with an apple in his hand, not offering it, simply resting it on his palm. Lucas sat a few yards back, silent for once, watching. Grace had left more ointment and a few words of encouragement before heading out to another call. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, only let the hours pass with the sun warming his shoulders. At first, Ash ignored him, grazing in the distance. But the longer Ethan sat, the more the horse's ears flicked toward him. Curiosity warred with caution. Finally, Ash stepped closer. 10 feet, then 8, then 5. Ethan kept his eyes lowered, pretending to study the grass. The apple's sweet scent hung in the air. Then, with a swiftness that nearly startled Ethan, Ash lowered his head and plucked the fruit from his palm. The horse jerked back immediately, chewing fast, eyes wide, but he did not flee. Lucas let out a soft laugh, covering his mouth quickly. Ethan didn't smile. Not yet. He knew the difference between a single moment and a pattern. Still, his chest eased. Just slightly. Over the next days, the ritual repeated. Ethan would sit with quiet patience, and Ash would come, each time staying a little longer after taking the offering. By the week's end, the horse lingered even after the apple was gone, lowering his head near Ethan's shoulder, nostrils flaring against the farmer's sleeve. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the sky with streaks of orange and violet, Ash did something Ethan hadn't expected. He walked toward Lucas. The boy froze, breath caught in his throat. Ash stopped within arm's reach, eyes studying him carefully. Lucas lifted a trembling hand, pausing in midair. For a moment it seemed the mustang would turn away, but then Ash leaned forward, brushing his muzzle against the boy's knuckles before stepping back. Lucas's face lit with something fierce and tender all at once. "He trusts us," he whispered. Ethan looked at the boy, and then at the scarred horse, feeling a fragile thread stretch between them all. He knew better than to declare victory. Trust could shatter with the next loud noise, the next unfamiliar shadow. But for now, it held. And sometimes, he thought, that was enough. That night, Ethan returned to the porch, the stars sharp above the dark horizon. He leaned on the railing, listening to Ash move in the pasture, the soft thud of hooves, the steady rhythm of breathing. For the first time in years, he felt less alone. Fragile, yes, but not alone. He whispered into the cool night air, a vow carried only by the crickets and the breeze. "We'll keep building." No matter how many times it breaks, Ash lifted his head, ears flicking toward the sound, and Ethan felt the fragile trust flare again, faint but real, like a candle refusing the dark. The morning broke clear and pale, the kind of light that made the fields shimmer like they were brushed with silver. Ethan woke before his alarm, though he had not slept deeply. The habit of rising with the sun was so deeply etched in him, it was as steady as his heartbeat. He brewed coffee, the bitter steam filling the kitchen, and stepped onto the porch with the mug warming his hands. For a long while, he simply listened. The hush of grass bending under dew, the low murmur of cattle beyond the far fence, the faint buzz of insects beginning their daily song. He looked toward the grove, as he did every morning now. Ash was there, but not in the distance as usual. The mustang stood closer, grazing along the fence line, his coat bright against the dawn. Ethan froze, hardly daring to breathe. He had grown used to watching the horse from afar, their fragile bond measured in steps carefully given and taken. But this morning, the distance was already gone. Lucas arrived not long after, his bike skidding to a stop in the yard. The boy's hair stuck out from under his cap, his face lit with excitement. "He's near the house," he whispered, as though afraid loud words might undo the miracle. Ethan only nodded, eyes fixed on the mustang. Together they walked slowly toward the fence. Ash lifted his head at their approach, ears twitching, but he did not retreat. Instead, he took one deliberate step forward, then another, until he stood just a breath away, steam rising from his nostrils in the chill air. Ethan set his mug carefully on the fence post. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, palm open. The horse leaned in, warm breath curling against his skin, then pressed his muzzle firmly into Ethan's rough palm. The touch was no accident, no fleeting brush. It was choice. Lucas let out a gasp of wonder. "He chose you again." Ash's ears flicked, then he shifted, stretching his neck to nudge Lucas's shoulder. The boy's eyes widened. He raised his hand slowly, and this time the Mustang didn't shy. Lucas's fingers brushed along the damp curve of Ash's jaw. For a moment, the three of them stood together in the quiet morning light, a circle bound not by words, but by presence. Grace arrived later with supplies, her station wagon kicking up dust on the lane. She stopped short when she saw the scene. Ash standing calm at the fence, his head lowered between man and boy, as if the three had been born to share the same space. "Well," she said softly, her smile carrying relief and pride, "looks like progress to me." Ethan didn't answer. He was afraid that speaking might break the spell. Instead, he ran his hand down Ash's neck, feeling the ridges of scars beneath the damp coat. Each line was a history, a wound written in flesh, yet the horse stood steady, unflinching, as though he had finally decided to let someone share the burden. Grace eventually moved forward, her voice calm. She examined Ash with careful eyes, noting the fading wounds, the weight returning to his frame. "He's healing," she murmured. "More than I hoped this soon." She glanced at Ethan, then Lucas. And not just on the outside. When she left, the yard returned to stillness. Ethan sat on the porch with Lucas perched beside him, both sipping from cups of coffee and cocoa, watching Ash graze nearby. The boy spoke first, his voice low. "It feels different now. Like he belongs here." Ethan looked out across the fields, then at the horse. Belonging was a word he hadn't allowed himself for years, not since the house grew too quiet and the routines became his only company. But as Ash lifted his head, meeting his eyes across the yard, Ethan felt the word take root in him too. The morning stretched, soft and unhurried, as though time itself understood the importance of stillness. For once, Ethan didn't think about shadows or barns or men with trucks and money. He thought only of this fragile peace, the quiet morning, the boy beside him, the horse who had stepped willingly into their circle. And deep in his chest, something shifted, fragile, but certain. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was close. By late afternoon, the light turned honey thick, pooling in the low places between rows of milo. Ethan dragged a hose across the yard, letting it snake and glitter in the sun, while Lucas swept the porch steps with the small, determined fury of a boy who wanted to be useful. Ash grazed a stone's throw away, close enough that the soft rip of grass sounded like a breath being unspooled. The day had been kind, no trucks idling on the road, no rumors drifting in from town, only work that asked for muscle and gave back the quiet reward of order. When the tank filled, Ethan shut off the spigot and leaned against the fence. He'd never been much for naming things. The cattle were numbers, the fields were compass points, even the storms were filed as dates in a ledger, but the horse had insisted on being more than a fact. "Ash," he had said once, because dust and ruin felt honest. Now, with the sun layering silver along the Mustang's neck and the scars dulled to pale threads, the name sat wrong in his mouth, like a coat that no longer fit. Lucas hopped down the porch steps and came to stand beside him. "He keeps choosing the yard," the boy said, not hiding the awe in his voice. "Like he wants to stay close." Ethan nodded. "Close doesn't always mean safe," he said out of habit, but he heard the reflex in his own tone and let it pass. Safety was a kind of weather, welcome when it came, not something you could order from a catalog along with home insurance and a spare gate hinge. He watched the horse lift his head and stare past them toward the house. That gaze had changed things in him he hadn't had language for. Grief had taught him silence. The Mustang had taught him to share it. Grace's station wagon rolled up the lane, tires whispering on gravel. She hopped out with a small tub of salve and a practiced smile. "How's our patient?" she asked, then paused when she followed their eyes. "Closer every day," she said softly. "Good. That's good." They worked in a hush, Ethan holding a pan of warm water, Lucas standing steady with a brush, Grace's hands moving slow as prayer across a flank where the skin still felt tender. The horse flinched once, then settled, choosing stillness over flight. When they finished, Grace capped the salve and stepped back to look at the three of them, as if measuring a house frame for square. "He's mending," she said. "Outside and in." She glanced at Ethan. "You are too." He let the comment pass without defense. The truth didn't need arguing. Grace checked her watch, another call on the far side of town, and drove off with a wave that felt like a blessing. Evening slid in around them, blue deepening along the hedgerow and the first nighthawks cutting dark commas across the sky. Ethan fetched 2 apples from the kitchen and handed one to Lucas. "No talk," he said, not unkindly. "Let him decide." They stood with palms open. Ash came like a tide, cautious and certain at once, the heavy head swinging between them. He took the boy's apple first, crunching with the satisfaction of an honest meal, then turned to Ethan's hand and breathed, a warm fog curving into the old farmer's scarred palm. "Hey there," Ethan murmured. He didn't stroke the horse at first. He simply stood still and let the nearness do its work. The Mustang leaned a fraction, weight like a vow. A name rose in Ethan's mouth with the quiet inevitability of a truth that had been waiting its turn. He didn't plan it. He didn't test it. He just said it. "Haven." Lucas looked up. "What?" Ethan kept his eyes on the horse. "Not Ash anymore," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "He's earned something softer." Haven. The boy tried it out, tasting the word like a new road on the tongue. Haven. He grinned, and the grin didn't feel like armor this time. "Yeah. That fits." The Mustang flicked an ear, as if answering to a sound he'd never heard but recognized all the same. Ethan let his hand move then, slow and certain down the warm slope of neck. Haven stood for it, the big body loosening by degrees until the last of the day drained from his muscles and from Ethan's too. Naming didn't change flesh, but it changed the way a man held it in his mind. Ash was what had happened. Haven was what could be. They led no halter, asked no trick. They walked together to the shallow tank at the yard's edge. Haven drank, the ripples throwing back a small, starlit version of the sky that was coming. Crickets started their evening clocks. Somewhere a screen door clapped on a neighbor's porch, the sound carried on a wind that smelled faintly of cut hay and far-off rain. Lucas sat cross-legged in the dust, elbows on knees. "Do you think he remembers the barn?" he asked, voice careful around the word. "Memory's not a straight line," Ethan said. He thought of his ledger with its columns for outflows and inflows, of the envelope in the drawer that still held the last letter his wife had written, the one about refinancing the mortgage and maybe finally fixing the porch swing. He thought of the folder of policy papers, farm insurance, life insurance, that had outlived the woman they were meant to protect. Sometimes it's a circle. Sometimes it's a place. He looked at the horse. Sometimes it's a name you don't need anymore. The porch light came on by habit when the dusk settled, painting a warm square on the yard. Haven stepped into the edge of that light and stopped there, half gold, half blue. It made something ache sweetly in Ethan's chest, the way an old hymn found your throat without being asked. He remembered the night the chain dropped in the grove, the sick freedom of it. He remembered the fireworks, and the way the horse had pressed his head to a human shoulder and refused panic. He remembered the morning the animal stood at the fence and did not ask for permission to belong. The math of those moments added up to more than safety. It added up to home. "Welcome, then," Ethan said aloud, "to what we've got. To what we keep." Haven lowered his head and grazed at the porch step like a dog would nose a doorway. Lucas laughed softly. "He's going to stay, isn't he?" "Staying's a choice you make every day," Ethan said. "But tonight?" "Yes." They put away the brush and the bucket. Lucas pedaled home, his taillight blinking a small red heart down the lane. Ethan tidied the kitchen, wiped the sink dry like it mattered, and carried a blanket to the porch. He didn't plan to sleep outside, but he wanted the house open, the door unlatched, the light a little beacon. Haven lingered in that warm square, ears swiveling, content to be neither in nor out, just near when the night got truly dark, the kind that pressed against your ribs. Ethan sat on the step and let his mind walk through the rooms where absence had lived. The quiet used to echo. Now it answered. He thought of Sheriff Tom and his warnings, of Grace's steady hands, of a boy who needed a place to spend his summers being 14 instead of 40. He thought of the barn by Miller's Creek, and the circles carved into dirt to make pain into spectacle. He thought, finally, of his wife, and his throat tightened, not with the old panic, but with a gratitude as plain as bread. The world had taken, and yet here it was, giving back a little. Haven shifted closer until the soft heat of the Mustang stood like a wall at his back. Ethan leaned into it without thinking, and felt the animal breathe. He breathed with him, in, out. The same weather moving through two bodies. "Good night, Haven," he said. There was no tremor in him now, only a steadiness that felt earned. Rest. "We're all right?" The horse dozed standing, the way horses do. The porch bulb haloed them both and drew a few harmless moths to worship its warmth. Somewhere a freight train laid its low horn along the prairie and carried on. The farm slept. The name held. And for the first time since the hospital bed, Ethan let himself believe in a future that did not require forgetting the past. It required sheltering it, gently, wisely, inside a present that could hold two truths at once: what had hurt you, and what would heal you. Haven lifted his head once toward the road, listening. Nothing there. He put his head down again. Near enough. Safe enough. Home enough. The Kansas summer ripened into full strength, painting the fields a deep, living green. The corn whispered in rows, the prairie grass bent and swayed like waves, and the sky stretched unbroken, a dome of pale fire. Ethan Walker woke early, as he always did, but there was something different in the air that morning. The silence didn't feel heavy or watchful. It felt open, like the beginning of a hymn. He brewed coffee, strong and dark, and carried the mug to the porch. Haven was already there, grazing near the fence as if he had always belonged. The scars on his hide had faded to pale etchings, reminders rather than wounds. Ethan studied him with a kind of quiet awe. The horse was not healed, some things never fully healed, but he was whole. Lucas arrived with the sun climbing, his bike rattling down the lane, his face flushed with anticipation. "Morning," he called, breathless but bright. He leaned the bike against the porch and ran straight to the pasture. Haven lifted his head, ears twitching, then trotted toward the boy with an ease that once would have been unthinkable. Lucas laughed, his voice carrying across the yard like a bell. Ethan joined them, stepping into the grass with a handful of oats. Haven nosed the grain from his palm, then stood, waiting. The old farmer reached up, brushing his fingers along the white neck, feeling the strength beneath. "You've chosen," Ethan murmured. "This is home." Grace drove up later, her station wagon coated with dust, her eyes bright despite long hours on the road. She watched Haven canter across the pasture, his stride steady even with the faint hitch in his leg. "He's stronger than I imagined he'd ever be," she said. "You've given him something no medicine could." Ethan shook his head. He gave it to himself. "I only stayed still long enough for him to find it." The three of them stood together, farmer, vet, and boy, watching the Mustang run. His mane flew wild, catching the sun like silver flame. Each stride was a refusal, of chains, of scars, of everything meant to break him. And yet, it wasn't anger that drove him now. It was joy, unrestrained and fierce. As Haven slowed, trotting back toward them, Ethan felt a swell of something he hadn't let himself carry in years. Not hope, exactly, but belonging. He thought of the nights he'd spent on the porch, the rifle across his lap, waiting for shadows. He thought of the barn by Miller's Creek and the marks carved into posts. He thought of the fireworks, the storm, the boy's tears, the fragile steps toward trust. All of it had led here, to a field where scars no longer dictated the story. Lucas reached out, and Haven lowered his head into the boy's hands. The sight made Ethan's throat tighten. He had lost much, carried more than he thought he could, but in this quiet moment, with the Mustang pressed against the boy's shoulder, he understood something simple. Survival was never the end of the story. It was the start of choosing what came next. The wind picked up, bending the grass in rolling waves. Haven stepped closer to Ethan, pressing his muzzle into the farmer's palm with a certainty that needed no words. Ethan closed his fingers gently, feeling the living weight of trust. "We made it," he whispered. "Both of us." Haven snorted softly, the sound carrying like agreement. Lucas grinned through damp eyes, and Grace turned her face to the wind, letting it lift the weariness from her shoulders. The day stretched ahead, endless as the field itself, and in that vastness, under a sky too wide to measure, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe that broken things could be made whole, not by forgetting their scars, but by carrying them together. The horse grazed again, the boy laughed, and the farmer stood steady, the porch behind him and the endless field before him. For the first time in years, The silence on his farm wasn't heavy. It was full. And now, it's your turn. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple comment, maybe 0 or 1, to let me know you were here, and that you felt it too. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bond between people and horses. Stories of healing, hope, and second chances that you won't want to miss.